Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Coleman here on behalf of Blandon Foundation, and thanks for joining at our first Arrowhead Intelligent Region webinar. And thanks a lot of faces I know that were on our event last week. You should have received an email with the notes from the meeting. That was fun to take all those different comments and try and put them into a document that was cogent and do a little interpreting and grouping and so on. And it was fun to put that together, fun to read the notes and see where the consensus lays. So today we have Robert Bell back with us, and Robert's going to lead us through now. This is the first of 7 webinars that will give, by the end of it, you'll all be experts in the intelligent community framework, the method, and expert in the factors that Robert uses to organize this way of thinking about community economic development. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Robert Bell.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and thanks to the Blandon Foundation for making this possible. Bernadine, I love your hat.
It's 24 degrees below zero here today, Robert.
That's fine. I understand. And I take that very seriously. It's a beautiful, sunny, and almost slightly warm day here. So you can hold that close to your heart and hope for the best. Today, we're going to spend some time together in several different ways. I'm going to do a bit of a tutorial on the issues that are in the title of this thing, Digital Challenge, Digital Opportunity. There'll be some time for questions and answers. If there's things in there that you want to have explained more, or some comments you want to offer on it. And then finally, we'll be breaking into some discussion groups. I've got a set of questions that I think again will help you grapple with the concepts in here and figure out how they apply specifically maybe to your life, to the life of the people you know, to the community that you're in and that you serve. And then we'll come back and end it all. And we'll get that all done in about an hour. So I appreciate your attention and your time here. So step 1 is to see whether or not we can successfully share the screen. Yes, let's see. Come on, let's go. There we go. So the question, I got to finish sharing it. The question I have is, can you see a screen which says Digital Challenge and Digital Opportunity? Yes? Yes, good, thank you. Okay, that is indeed our topic here. Just again, for anyone who was not with us last week when I very briefly introduced ICF, we are a couple of things. We are a network of more than 190 cities and metro areas and counties around the world with a big range of population, all focused on this interesting 3-part goal of economic, social, and cultural growth, because increasingly they are the same thing. And we're also advisors based upon the learning that we do from that network, bringing this thing we call the ICF method to communities that are just dealing on the front lines of dealing with the disruptions of the digital age. We do a lot of stuff: consulting, training, benchmarking, publishing, conferences, events, an international award program, all designed to gather data and turn it into lessons. And we've dealt with a lot of people in a lot of places, communities of all sizes in many, many different parts of the world. So we are living in an age of digital transformation. And if you read anything in the business press these days, you have undoubtedly seen that term, that is changing almost everything that matters. And this is now almost a cliche. You've probably read it, you've heard it, everybody's talking to you about it. But I don't know how much time we spend actually trying to live with what it really means and what the consequences are, even though they're all around us. So we're going to just drill into that a little bit and see how these things all fit together. And of course, you know what some of this looks like, right? It's Facebook and Netflix and Uber and Google and Amazon and Apple and Zoom. Those are the headline names about these things, but those are basically the best understood and the best known examples of something that's really a digital revolution. If you go back 40 years to 1980, there were no personal computers. Kind of hard to imagine. There were no mobile phones and there was no internet. But fax machines, those were the absolutely hot technology of the day. In fact, I remember seeing my first one when I got out of college. I said, what the heck is this? If you go forward 35 years, we were shipping 260 million computers a year. iPhone and Android had put supercomputers in our pockets, computers many, many, many times more powerful than the ones that filled a room back in the 80s. And billion-dollar e-commerce, social media, online streaming companies, and by the way, none of those categories existed 30 years ago, have been overturning retail, publishing, broadcasting, food delivery, transportation, and you could keep going on that list, including a bunch of startups that are just beginning to try to do that. So we're all kind of used to that. You know, we keep coming up with new things that we didn't realize we couldn't live without, like Netflix movies. And yet there's something else going on alongside it, and it is employment disruption. And there's a couple of simple numbers that capture what that really means. Back in 1990, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, the three biggest auto companies in the world at that point, did about $65 billion in sales. Now we're measuring that in 2015 dollars because I'm going to be comparing it to something in 2015. So the equivalent of $65 billion in 2015. And they employed 1 million people to do it with. If you fast forward to 2015, Apple, Facebook, and Google are the three largest tech companies. At that time, they had together about $1 trillion in sales. Now, Apple alone has more than $1 trillion. And they did it all with 137,000 people. And that's the story. We have got this incredible revolution that's creating all this economic growth, and yet it doesn't need as many people as it used to, and certainly to do the jobs that used to be done. The jobs that are being done in many cases are different. And this is compounded by an ever-growing demand for skills and knowledge. This statistic from OECD still floors me every time I see it. It comes from the depths of the financial crisis. And OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's the, if you will, it's the club of the 30 rich nations in the world plus Mexico. Don't know why Mexico's there, but they are. Half of the long-term unemployed in August of 2009 were people who left school at the minimum age that they were allowed to do it. Half. And of course, we all know the long-term unemployed is our biggest problem, right? The longer you're unemployed, the harder it is to get another job. And these are all people who don't have skills and are not finding employment in the economy. And what's happening is that our economy is turning into two, and I call them the gold economy and the copper economy. And in the gold economy, well, you have workers who find good jobs in growth industries or in industries with a great deal of stability, like government in many ways. And because they have knowledge, because they have skills, and they build experience over time in doing difficult things, they earn good wages because they add big individual value to their jobs. One person is not just as, cannot just be replaced by another person who is exactly the same. These people have serious skills. And as a result of this, they live in prosperous neighborhoods full of attractive amenities and attractive retail. It's a nice life. Now, copper is really useful. Copper we make pipes out of, we make the wires that carry electricity, not to mention the internet out of it. And yet, of course, it's also what we make pennies out of. So in the copper economy, workers are stuck in menial jobs that have few prospects for advancement of any kind. Why? Well, because those jobs are very cut and dried. They add very little individual. Oh, hello, I've got somebody trying to talk to me. Let me get rid of him. Go away. They add very little individual value because of the nature of the job doesn't allow it. And therefore they earn low wages. And that means they live paycheck to paycheck, as we all know what this story looks like, in poor housing, limited retail, and few amenities. So this kind of situation where you have vast amounts of innovation in technology that are changing our economy, that are creating employment disruption, and that lead to this kind of division in our society, pose a question for all of us. And it is, how can your local economy be more golden than coppery? I mean, it's really pretty straightforward at the end of the day. And it is, we believe at ICF, it is the #1 challenge that communities face in this time of great opportunity created by change, but also great risk and great disruption. And what's happened with this so far is well, it's frightening, is what it is. In urban areas, we see an immense concentration of talent, of broadband, of investment that reinforce the traditional strength of cities as centers of growth. The oldest city we know in the world is in India. It was founded about 3,000 years ago. And the basic premise of the big city hasn't changed. You bring together a whole lot of people, and they generate a lot of money, and you create some wealth, you create economic activity, you ultimately create culture by doing that. And so up till now, this technology disruption we've all seen has actually been increasing that trend, which is quite, well, in a way, it's quite odd, which I'll go into in a moment, but it's really visible. You now have these massive hubs of innovation that are so expensive that nobody can afford to live in them. And yet somehow they keep going. Meanwhile, the suburbs around them have actually done pretty well because they offer a lower cost and a higher quality of life than the urban cores usually. And they've actually been outcompeting city centers for job creation because they have a much better quality of life and lower costs, but they still have the same kinds of access to talent, to broadband, to investment. And meanwhile, of course, in the reality that much of northern Minnesota lives in, you have our rural areas, which are not experiencing the same thing. They tend to have low population density. That limits the profit opportunity available to a telecommunications company to wire you up, which makes it hard for them to deliver service. You also have, of course, in most cases, and this is unless you're either lucky or very smart, you tend to have less access to education, less access to infrastructure, less access to investment, because it's just a lot harder there. So this is a pretty, terrible picture, quite frankly. And yet at ICF, we think that the picture we carry around in our heads of this is unduly pessimistic, is unduly gloomy. And while the challenges are big, we think there's a very different future waiting for us. And we think that based upon a lot of experiences with a lot of communities around the world. Because if you sit and think about what the internet is, it is a network of network. It's a distributed technology. If I've got an internet connection, I can literally be any place in the world. One of the strangest, one of the sort of odd moments I had of this was when I was on a business trip to Singapore, and I pulled out my little map application and I let it navigate me somewhere. And then I stopped and thought, wait a minute, this little computer in my pocket has got a map technology. I'm on the other side of the planet, but I've got a connection, so I'm powerful. I thought, that's kind of amazing. Well, the same thing is true actually of our economy. Working from home, there's a network function, right? And it was available for a long, long, long time, but it wasn't until we actually needed it that all of a sudden we all jumped on this ability to work from home, working remotely over a network. And entertainment at home, thank goodness when the workday is over, right? We've got all kinds of things that are available to us no matter where we are, as long as we have that connection. Virtual companies, you almost certainly have some in your communities. These companies with 2 or 3 people in one location, but another 2 or 3 in another location, and another 10 in another location, and 1 in yet another. And together, because of the connectivity they have and because of the platforms that let them collaborate, they function quite well. My little organization, ICF, actually, we're a virtual company. We have an office, but it really doesn't count. What we have is people at the other ends of internet connections. Along with that is crowdsourcing, right? Whether it's crowdsourcing to develop ideas or crowdsourcing to vote on things or crowdsourcing to raise money. That was never possible before, and it is literally utterly distributed. No matter where you are, you can tap a national network potentially with that. E-commerce is, of course, the example that COVID has shoved in our faces, but it truly is distributed. I mean, it's unbelievable, the power of it. Telemedicine, same thing. COVID has made us aware that this thing exists and that it is part of a distributed solution that can reach anywhere. Interestingly enough, e-commerce, of course, has caused a big decline in conventional retail. And that's been very tough for retail workers even before COVID-19 came along. But it's had an accompanying very fast growth in warehouse capacity. That's not all good because those jobs actually require higher skills than a standard retail job. But nonetheless, it's one of the positive effects of this. And finally, cloud services. You almost certainly use them, whether it's Salesforce or pet care or a number of other things. And they're available everywhere. So if you think about this and you think about the availability of these kinds of assets, it makes you begin to develop a different picture of what the future is going to look like. And this is the future that we see over and over again when we're dealing with communities. And that is, it allows outlying suburbs, and I'm talking about the exurbs, the places that are not just like the community I live in, close to New York City in this case, and really rural communities build dynamic local economies, strong societies, and very rich cultures that offer them a very sustainable future. And I know that's an idea that's kind of hard to accept because you've got the scars to show how difficult it can be. And yet it really is the truth. The key is you have to know how, because the rules for doing it are not the same as the standard rules for economic development, the standard rules for social services, the standard rules for bringing culture to your community or promoting it. They're a little bit different. And I'm going to provide an example just to make that clearer. This is a place I'd like to introduce you to. If you've never heard of it, it's called Stratford. And it's in the province of Ontario in Canada, north across the border. And Stratford is about 90 minutes by car, except in bad traffic, which Toronto has a lot of, from Toronto, the biggest city and the economic center of Canada. And here it is a little closer up. You'll notice it's got Shakespeare Gardens. Well, that's because Stratford, which is upon the Avon River in Ontario, is named after Stratford upon Avon in England. And the Shakespearean Gardens thing, well, that's a tale I'll tell in just a moment. So here's Stratford. It's a smallish city, about 31,000. It's at the center of a rural province, not province, county. In fact, it's the breadbasket of Ontario. And so like many rural cities, it has a bit of an urban core, but as soon as you drive 2 minutes in any direction, and now you're out in the countryside again. So it's got that really mixed urban and urban, suburban, and rural all within a very short distance. And until a little while ago, it was known as that quaint little city about 90 minutes from Toronto, known for the Stratford Shakespeare Festival. That's what it was known for. And everybody loved going to Stratford and seeing a play and eating in a restaurant and going home. Well, that's not how it is today. So we're dealing with an economy in Stratford that has got a major agricultural component. Their biggest crop is winter wheat, and they sell it all around the globe. And that's in the great Canadian tradition, they will say, of being hewers of wood and bearers of water. In Canada, traditionally, they grow stuff or they make stuff out of the ground and they sell it to somebody else to do something with. And this is definitely how they've been running their economy for a long time. In addition to that, Stratford has had a light industrial economy that has prospered in some decades and then collapsed after that. I mean, it's cycle after cycle. It's really been quite remarkable. They were a locomotive repair and maintenance yard for the Canadian Railroad. That got decentralized out from underneath them. They were in furniture manufacturing, the biggest furniture manufacturing capital in Canada. That fell apart underneath them. Automotive parts manufacturing was big until, of course, the US automakers collapsed. So you see the pattern there. Light industrial economy constantly depended upon outsiders who had a lot more influence over its direction than they did. And they did also have the Shakespeare Festival, which was actually an economic development project of its own. Back in the 1950s, a brave journalist there went to city council and said he thought he could talk the most famous theater director in New York into coming up and starting a Shakespeare Festival there. And so they kind of looked at him and they thought, well, what the heck? Nothing else is working. So they gave him $25 because they thought that would be enough for him in New York, and it was back in those days. And he went down there and he had a meeting and he managed to get to see the director, and he didn't get an yes. He had to go back a few more times and talk and so forth. But believe it or not, in 1953, this guy named Tyrone Guthrie opened the Shakespeare Festival in a tent on the lawn with Sir Alec Guinness starring in Richard III. And from that that start, they went on to become the largest employer in Stratford. They employ 1,000 people at the height of the season, even though they're open for only 4 months a year. So really, really important, really successful cultural economics development strategy. But 8 months of the year, it's closed down. So in 2003, they elected a new mayor. He's a very entrepreneurial guy, big ambitions for Stratford, and he started putting them into place. And what the council sort of uncovered was a hidden gem. They're the owner of their own utility, their electric utility, which the province tried to get them to sell, but they didn't. And that, of course, becomes a wonderful piece of infrastructure for building a fiber network on top of it, because you already got the rights of way, you've already got a lot of infrastructure in place. They built what's called a dark fiber network, meaning that they were not in the service business, but rather they were leasing that to other companies. And that network, which was leased up by a couple of other companies, attracted the IT division of a major bank and 2 data centers. Now, this is not, when I say attract, I mean they had to work like crazy and do deals like crazy to get the first one of those there. And having done that, it was a lot easier to get the second one. And so right away, you see a huge change in the economic value proposition driven by that network. The bank with the IT division wanted to put its people in a really pleasant place. As long as they had good connectivity, that was going to work just fine. And at the same time, of course, it powered the growth of the Shakespeare Festival, which increasingly used that network capacity to market itself worldwide, and very, very effectively. It also became the foundation of a city Wi-Fi network, and partnerships with other carriers eventually led, and this is 10 years down the road, to a fiber to the premise network that was constructed and has been again successful. So that's a condensed version of a very long story for them that finally got them the beginnings of an information technology driven economy. But that wasn't enough, because they still have that problem of, well, gosh, it's just, people are outside of Stratford control our destiny. That bank may decide to re-centralize its IT staff back in Toronto. The data center may or may not continue, because data centers are being built like crazy everywhere. So they decided they wanted to own some of their own destiny, and they did. They spent 10 years convincing the University of Waterloo, which is Canada's biggest technology and business university, located about an hour away, to open a satellite campus in Stratford. And they raised money locally from some successful business people, and they managed to build the building, and they accepted a class. And the reason that it all worked was because they've got this interesting digital media resource called the Shakespeare Festival. And so these young people would come in, take a semester or 2 of classes there. They'd work with the festival. They'd work with the school system to train young people in digital media, all while taking classes and developing a degree in project management of all things. So really successful program that you wouldn't expect to be there. And the reason it worked is because Waterloo, the University of Waterloo, really wanted to have a digital media program, because they always want to be ahead of the game, but they didn't have the assets. They didn't know what to do with it. And so 10 years of trying eventually produced an answer. And then, not wanting to be left behind, they went out the very next year and raised a little bit of money, took an abandoned building that had been currently was vacant, and turned it into the Stratford Accelerator Center. And they had like 5 companies there within 2 years. Nothing big, but the right model, because they wanted to take the most entrepreneurial students from their program and give them a reason to start a business in Stratford, which, of course, when a business gets founded in a place, it tends to stay there. And just to sort of finish the story, fast forward a few years to 2019, and this is not necessarily vital in itself, but it's a great sign of what they managed to do. It was approved as an Ontario test site for autonomous and connected vehicles. Little city of 31,000 people, although 15 years earlier, no claim to fame that would ever have succeeded in here. And yet they built step by step the foundation of what we'll come to call an innovation economy that was going to generate jobs, companies, and wealth in Stratford that would tend to stay there. So this is a pattern that you will see again and again in different ways as we go through our webinars, where relatively small places have been able to think very, very big and to develop a model of their economy that opens them up to opportunity today in 2021, not pursuing the opportunities of 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago, but the opportunities that are available today, and then working really, really hard with their own people to try to upskill them to seize those opportunities individually. So what are the takeaways for Stratford, or for, if you were with me in my last webinar down below, you see a picture of the Corn Palace in Mitchell, South Dakota. I think there's 3 of them. And the first one, and this is just a key thing that we say to developers over and over and over again, you have to start where you are. Think as big as you want. By all means, think as big as you want. Think bigger until you scare yourself. But then leverage the assets and the experience that you already have to do things that create new value. It's really a matter of thinking differently. I will always treasure a comment from the economic development officer of a small city in Ohio who said, he said, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I decided that what I like best about your method is that the first step doesn't cost anything. All you have to do is change your mind. And I thought, yeah, of course, that can be the hardest thing to do, and to change the minds of those around you. And yet it really doesn't cost a thing. If you're going to make progress in this, you're going to do it in partnership with others. And I don't really need to say that to anybody who's part of this program, because this is something that Blandon has been communicating and living and preaching for a very long time, and it obviously works. That partnership has to have a very particular quality, though. It's not enough just to have a lot of meetings. It really does take some visionary leadership of some kind, like that mayor that I talked about in Stratford. Dan Matheson is his name. And that means the ability to think of something a little bit bigger than it seems possible, convincing people that it's not just a dream, but then also balancing that with team building, with genuine partnerships. So it's not all being shoved at people, but people do have a sense that they know where we're going to go, and where we're going to go is a good place to go. And finally, and forgive me if this seems like a Pollyanna-ish comment, but I really do believe it based on evidence that obstacles are just invitations to innovate. Plan, take action, accept the fact that you're going to lose sometimes, celebrate the victories that you do achieve, and keep moving. And that is how every one of the communities that we've worked with, that we've seen become successful, has done it. You don't need to plan forever. You certainly want to act as soon as possible. If it's not working, you want to change it. And if it is working, you want to make sure that people know it's working and keep doing more of it. And eventually you will get there, wherever there happens to be. So that's the end of my tutorial part of this. And I wanted to just sort of turn it over to you to see if there are questions about any of this, or comments, or whether this resonates with your experience as innovators in your own community.
Robert, when communities build on their natural resources economy, what kind of things do you see happening? The idea of diversifying the economy based on the natural resources in northern Minnesota, that's not a new concept, but we have not really seen the leaps forward in value added and kind of things that people have always, that the $100,000 consultants say you should do. We have a hard time operationalizing those in some of these small ways. Do you have any examples?
Sure, and it's a great question, because again, you need to build on what you've got. So in one of the communities, let's see, it's northern part of the US, I think. They've got a long-standing, they got a big agricultural sector. And so they thought, well, what else can we do with this? What has agriculture got? What has agriculture got that can have more value than what we already have? And I think they had a university in a neighboring city, and the usual personal connections led to something where they realized that agricultural waste was a potentially very valuable product. It turns out that you can take all that stuff, put it into a process plant, and turn it into, I can't remember, it's a something sugar, which is not really a sugar like you'd put on your cereal in the morning. It is a base product in a vast number of things, from cosmetics to plastics and on and on and on. And so they, put together the plan. They went out, they found some grant funding to get a small thing started. They proved the concept. They were able to get some more funding based upon that. And they basically have built a plant to do that. So now they're taking the same agricultural land, producing the same stuff, and increasing the value that they get out of it. And at the same time, of course, they're doing it using scientific processes. They're doing it in ways that create demand for labor that is capable of running that kind of process plant. And so it's kind of a win in both ways. Other places that have been, that forestry communities have been clever about about researching new ways to use wood. And I don't know if any of you've seen the stories. The Scandinavians are ahead of us on this as usual. They've got a number of sort of R&D / farming / lumbering groups working together to create wood that they're going to use to build high rises out of it. And there's already a couple of high rise buildings without any, concrete or rebar or steel in them. They're just made out of wood. So yeah, it's, what have I got and how can I increase the value of it? What have I got lying around? What's my waste product? And can it be used for something more interesting? I mean, that's why the natural gas industry exists, because it used to be a waste product and it turned out it had value.
Good. Thank you, Robert.
I would just comment, Robert, that we here we're very fortunate in the Arrowhead. We have it's NRRI, the Natural Resources Research Institute, affiliated with the University of Minnesota Duluth. They have a whole crew of people over there. I see Whitney nodding, that looks at wood extracts and innovative uses of natural resources. Then there's a mineral lab over here in Coleraine. So I think, that there's opportunity for us to do a better job of shortening that link between innovation and economic something that comes out of that. I don't know, Whitney, do you have any thoughts about what we could do better to get on the engine of NRI?
Well, and I think Betsy's on too, but I know there's been a lot of that commercialization, right? Taking it from the NRRI lab to actually to a business or whatever is where the struggle has been, from my understanding.
Well, and Whitney, I just, again, and you're right, that is the struggle. The way that the communities seem to deal with that most successfully is to not go it alone, right? So you're not going to depend upon some business person, small business, to make some kind of substantial investment at high risk to carry it out, right? You're going to try to get in the ring with them. So it's the city or county government consulting with them and bringing in resources of education and training and constantly working that who can contribute to this and find a way to benefit from it. And can we get them at the table? And it takes a lot longer than it would be just to try to get somebody to do something now. But ultimately, you build a foundation that supports the growth of that tender new thing called, a new business or a new business process over time without having a huge amount of money you're going to throw at it. And in addition, it has another benefit as well, which is by creating those sets of partnerships, you're actually creating a new kind of infrastructure, if you will, a human infrastructure that can support the next change, the next good thing. And you're also, when you have inevitable failures, you can kind of fall back and regroup together and figure out what it is you're going to do next. So that kind of teaming up across business, academia, community colleges, city government, county government, nonprofits is ultimately how smaller places can best succeed.
Well, and this is Betsy. Yeah, Robert, and to your point, Bernadine, that's where we're not doing it well, is we do have a lot of really cool IP that NRI has found and created and researched. The problem is translating it to industry application and into that business world. And part of what we don't have, to what Robert's saying, is we don't have that group of business owners sitting around that table with them, having that conversation, saying, this is all sort of the IP up for grabs. Where does it fit? How do we make it, when we find a lot of the benefit, I think, is when the business approaches NRI with, I have this thing that I'm doing. I'd like to, migrate into this industry niche. I think this might be how to do it, but I need some assistance. And then the research teaming up with the business plus the support of the development folks there really is impactful. And so, yeah, it's that building that collaborative entity or engine around taking some of these things and spinning them out into industry. I think that is the area we're really trying to figure out how to do well.
to give you an example, sort of at the other end of the spectrum, both in terms of scale and in terms of geography, Taiwan is very active in the intelligent community movement, and they have this sort of secret thing that nobody, if you don't know it, you don't know it, and that's the majority of us in the world, called the Industrial Research Something Bureau, which is a governmental organization that is basically does R&D, right? But their structure is that anything that they do has to be 50% funded by the private sector. And so that's the first bar to pass. And what that means is that they've got a very practical point of view at this thing. They're not just sitting around in a laboratory coming up with great ideas. They're actually looking for partners who want to make money from the things that they develop. And that's just one of the many reasons that Taiwan is the place where every computer and most of the computer chips in the world come from. When I was a kid, it was all cheap ceramics and flashlights that broke easily. And in just a generation, they become one of the most innovative places in the world. So yeah, that's a whole different scale. It's a national government, but it's the same principle. It's exactly the same principle. And that's something that at ICF we observe over and over again, that very, very large cities and whole countries sometimes, the principles are exactly the same. It's just a question of scaling it to what works at where you are with what you've got.
I'm glad we're spending a little bit of time talking about innovation, because I know that in the conversation afterwards and the report that the group was, noticed that relative to all of the 6 pillars of ICF, that innovation was one of the places that our region isn't stacking up as well. And we do have this amazing engine of research at NRI. We also have a lot of leadership tables here in the Arrowhead. And I also happen to know that NRI does have their labs. They have different advisory groups, right? The different groups have business that are supposed to be advising them. So I'm just wondering, as we think about opportunities to invest in some innovative things here as part of this program, what are our touch points as a leadership group with NRI? Are they, where do we touch them? And what could we do to get them involved in this effort here in the next 6 months going forward?
It's a great question. I like to say that one of the most unheralded powers of government, whether it's local government or county government or state government, is the power to convene people. If the mayor invites a set of people to come over for a working lunch, they're probably going to come. And if that working lunch produces something that makes people interested, then it has a chance to go on. And so I think that we kind of miss that. That can be a huge power for good, is to bring together folks and get them starting to realize ultimately success comes from all these players who have come from different parts of the economy, if you will, to realize that they're all trying to do the same thing. The educators are trying to do the same thing. The NRR is trying to do the same thing. The businesses are trying to do the same thing. The communities are trying to do the same thing. They just don't understand that they're natural partners. So that's my only sort of off the cuff answer is, I think there's an opportunity to convene, a group. I would suggest even a group of communities where there's an obvious connection to some of the things that this organization is doing, and start having some conversations. It all starts
Robert,
with
you wanted to go into small groups?
Yes, now is the time to go in some small groups. So let me just move this over. What I'd like to encourage you to do in your small groups is to answer these questions. And Bill or Christy, if you'd be kind enough to put them in the chat, or maybe I should, because I can just copy and paste them.
I think I got it in there.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
This is all just, kind of personal and experiential stuff. But again, and maybe this will seem too simple-minded, but what's an example of digital transformation among the people you know? No doubt there's a lot of it going on, but it can be surprising to you when you say it out loud and think about it. You realize that it's got a lot of depth to it that you might not have first considered. My daughters, when they were growing up, used to be able to watch television, work on their phones, and do their homework and get A's. And I never figured out how they did that. I decided there's a piece of transformation I'm just not going to catch up on, but it worked. How has digital transformation impacted your community today or in the past, for good or bad? I mean, it's not always easy to relate things that are going on in your community to that big wave of change. And yet, again, if you think about it a little bit, I think you'll find there's a lot of connection there. And lastly, what action have government, business, or nonprofits already taken in your area, in your community, in your county, to take advantage of digital transformation? So those are the things I'd love for you to talk about and come back to us with perhaps a few stories so that I can stop doing the talking and you can start doing the talking.
About 12 minutes, Robert, is that okay?
Yeah, well, it's not much, but it's what we'll do.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, I will send everybody over. And Robert, did you want to go into a group or?
I'd love to. Let me stop sharing my screen.
All right.
Thanks everyone for that. That was really interesting conversation in our group. We really talked a lot about the making things personal to people to think about change. You know, how is this change going to be affect me? How can my family or my work be positively affected by some new technologies? Bernadine, what was in your group?
Hi, well, we had a wonderful opportunity to kind of weave and introduce some people that are interested in community renewal and what's going on in Northeast Minnesota that are actually not in our region. So Jim, how do you pronounce your last name, Jim? I didn't hear that from you.
Oh, you're muted, sir.
Glowaski. Anyway, Jim is visiting with us, joined our group, and Sabina also, who's involved with the Smart North effort. And Jim did for IRRR this really interesting study about real estate trends and why so many people, there's this huge increase in sales and interest in moving up here in the wake of the pandemic. And so we were just thinking about how we could do a better job of weaving of this cross-sectoral thing, right? All these people that want to pull together and feeling good that this container that we have here, this process is a good way for people to connect across sectors. So we welcome that conversation.
Good. And Whitney, how about your group?
We kind of focused in on one potential project, which was super interesting. You know, the use of technology as an economic driver and innovation. And we were talking a lot about those like Airbnb boat rental. You know, the access, we always claim northeastern Minnesota from Cook County to Cooch, right? The great outdoors, access to the outdoors, but often our visitors and even our residents don't have access the great outdoors, you know? So we're kind of talking a little bit along those lines.
There's many times I've been on shore looking out at a lake saying, oh, it'd sure be nice to have a kayak or rent a fishing boat or, you know, so.
Yeah.
You get to go to the Voyageurs National Park, you know, just driving by Inner Falls. And then you all of a sudden you say, oh, well, look at this whole park, 90% of it is water. So you can sit there and look at the lake, but that's about it.
I thought it was just really interesting to think about. And anecdotally, I'm always like, do we bring our camper or do we bring our boat when I go traveling? Right?
Good questions. So we're about out of time. So I want to encourage people to come on Thursday at 1:00, and we'll be talking about the broadband as a factor of technology. Robert, do you want to close us out? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. I want to leave you with a question to think about, which is, of all the things that you think you need to do to develop your community or your nonprofit that you work for or wherever your particular passion is, what's the one most important thing? Right? What's the one most important thing that's going to change the most lives for the better? I don't know what that is in my own community, but I think I'm going to think about it now. So thank you very much for making the time to join us.
Good. Thanks, everyone. Make sure you let folks know that, this has been recorded. So if you have people who want to catch up and join in, it's at the broadband.blandonfoundation.org website on the webinars page, or the Arrowhead Intelligent Region page. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.